I don't understand what he's doing with regard to the genocide. I don't understand what he's doing with regard to the Houthis. And I don't understand what he's doing with regard to Iran, because these are all losing policies.
So recently, John Mearsheimer went on Glenn Greenwald's podcast. Glenn actually interviewed him, and they talked a little bit about Trump's foreign policy and each of the theaters that the U.S. is involved in right now, and why a lot of Trump's actions are being viewed as a betrayal. So let's watch and let's react. Mearsheimer's awesome.
One of the things I had discussed with you several times, and I think we haven't had you on since the November election, although if we did, we certainly haven't had you on since the inauguration, since the Trump presidency began. We talked several times during 2024 about what you thought might be the likely impact of Trump's election on these wars in the Middle East. And I think there was a sense that we know for sure what will happen if Joe Biden wins or Kamala Harris wins, which is a continuation of the status quo. They made no efforts for a ceasefire, occasionally made some noises about concerns for humanitarian ends, but really never used their leverage in any real way to back that up. But the issue of Trump was always, well, you really don't know what you're going to get. I mean, he talks a lot about how he prides himself on being the first American president not to involve the U.S. in a new war. He obviously was the one who facilitated that ceasefire and seemed to take a lot of pride in it. And yet now he's in office and he restarts Joe Biden's bombing campaign in Yemen, which I want to talk about, which is, you could count as a new war or a continued and escalated war. And then clearly he gave the green light to the Israelis, not just to unravel his ceasefire, but to go all in on whatever they wanted to do. What do you make of the expectation?
The one thing I do want to chime in before I hear from Mearsheimer here is to say the only thing I disagree with Glenn in that assessment is, yeah, in some ways Trump was viewed as a question mark in terms of foreign policy, but if you followed him closely, it wasn't like he was viewed as a question mark when it came to Israel and backing Israel's war and essentially the entire Israel lobby in the election cycle. He was given $100 million by Miriam Adelson. He stacked his cabinet full of Zionists. There wasn't that much mystery in terms of that theater, and that theater is very kind of impactful when it comes to Yemen and Iran. So in that regard, I don't think there is that much of a question mark. How bellicose he has been, maybe so, though.
Expectations that you had of the Trump administration and throughout 2024 versus the reality that we're now seeing?
I thought there was some chance that he would try to shut down the war. This is before he came into office. And I thought that in large part because he made much of the fact that he intended to be the president for peace, that he was not a warmonger, and that he was going to shut down the war in Europe, shut down the war in the Middle East. And then, of course, he forced Netanyahu to accept the ceasefire, which was initiated the day before Trump was inaugurated, January 20th of this year. And that gave one hope, because the ceasefire had 3 stages, but the second stage looked like it would really put an end to the conflict, that the Israelis would leave Gaza, and you'd have a ceasefire that would last for a long time. But of course, the Israelis refused to go to the second stage of the ceasefire. The Trump administration put no pressure on the Israelis. And indeed, the Trump administration blamed Hamas for the fact that you had not gone into the second stage. And that, of course, was not true. But anyway, Trump has disappointed us, and he's no different than Genocide Joe was.
Wow, that's bold. I mean, the actions taking place in Israel certainly don't seem to buck the status quo too much in terms of Gaza, but most of Gaza has been totally leveled at this point, it seems like. Also, part of that ceasefire deal and the second phase that Mearsheimer referred to involved hostage exchanges. And it seems like both sides kind of took the hostage exchange relatively seriously. I think many dozens of hostages on both sides were exchanged. But yeah, it's really kind of crazy that Trump was so instrumental in this ceasefire deal the day before he swore in as president, only to kind of give Netanyahu the green light to violate it, because obviously that conversation had to have taken place because the U.S. is bankrolling Israel with its weaponry and financial support.
I think that, and again, we saw this several times in the first term starting in 2017. Obviously, Trump's not a pacifist. I mean, he escalated bombing campaigns he inherited from Obama in the way he said he would against ISIS and Syria and Iraq, et cetera. But, you really didn't see this kind of militarism expressed. Now he's back in. He's utterly unconstrained, at least in his mind. I was just reading today, in fact, some Republicans in the White House saying basically in response to all this uproar about the collapsing stock market or the declining stock market, that he just doesn't care. He doesn't care about negative reactions from the public, doesn't care about negative reactions from the media. He feels like he got a mandate. He's going to do what he wants, and that's what he's setting out to do. And so I guess on one level, he seems to be in charge. It seems like he is determined to make sure that his will is carried out, a lot more so than in the first term, where I think there was a lot of sabotage, kind of undermining around him. This time he seems to really have had a plan, or people with him did, to make sure that everything that happens is because he wants it to happen. So what do you think accounts for that change? Like, why did he get into office right away and start bombing Yemen and giving the Israelis the green light to go wild, even wilder than they were before, and now threatening Iran with some sort of annihilation if they don't give the kind of deal that he wants on nuclear weapons?
Let me answer that, Glenn, by making a general point about Trump and then specifically answering your question. I think that in his first term, he was not a radical president. I think that he pursued one radical policy, and that was that he drastically altered our policy toward China. He abandoned engagement with China, and he pursued containment. That was the one, I think, radical shift in policy, both foreign and domestic, that took place in his first term.
I would just say warming of relations with North Korea, and that's a little bit related to China, but I think that's the biggest deal foreign policy-wise. And I know Mearsheimer knows about that, and I assume he believes the same about it, but just something worth noting.
And as many people have said, and Trump himself has acknowledged, the deep state basically boxed him in, much the way it boxed Obama in. When he came into office this time, I think because he had had 4 years to really think about it and think about how to deal with this issue, he came in with the thought in mind that he was going to get his way. And I think you see this, by the way, in the people that he has relied on to execute his policies. Elon Musk, for example, and Steve Witkoff. I think Musk is the key person, the key right-hand person for Trump on domestic policy, and Witkoff is the key right-hand person on foreign policy. Neither one of these individuals is part of the deep state. Neither one of these individuals is part of the Washington establishment. They're outsiders. They're Trump's buddies. They're the kind of people he can trust. He doesn't trust Marco Rubio and people of that sort. So what he did was he brought in his own team, and he set out to pursue a radical policy, both at the foreign policy level, and at the domestic level. And if you just laundry list a lot of the policies, it becomes manifestly clear that that's the case. First of all, with regard to tariffs. Secondly, with regard to the whole notion of conquering territory, like Greenland, the Panama Canal. Third, with regard to transatlantic relations. Fourth, with regard to relations with Russia. Then if you switch down to the domestic level, his approach towards dealing with the judiciary, his approach towards dealing with the deep state, his approach toward dealing with immigration, and his interest in wrecking universities. These are truly radical policies across the board. You didn't see this the first time round, but this time he's unleashed the dogs, and he has lieutenants, again, Witkoff and Musk, who are working with him in this regard. So at a very general level, I would say you do not want to underestimate what a transformational president he intends to be. And given that he's just in the beginning of a 4-year term, one can only wonder what this is all going to look like 4 years from now. So that's my general point.
Just a few things there. I think I'm mostly with Mearsheimer on this, but it's interesting to say that to be so sure that he trusts people like Musk and Witkoff, who he's only really befriended Musk relatively recently, it seems like, just in the run up to his presidential election. He's known Rubio forever. And to appoint the Secretary of State, someone you don't trust, really seems to be a mass drop moment about the whole Washington regime. Because if that's the case, it was clearly selected by the Israel lobby or Zionists or the military-industrial complex because Rubio's a neocon. He's a historical neocon. And if you ask me, Trump trusted in his first term John Bolton and Mike Pompeo way too much. People like that. So I don't necessarily buy that he distrusts a lot of his cabinet members. I think he trusts them enough to appoint them. Ultimately, it is him that has that appointment power, even though clearly he's being influenced by various lobbies.
My specific point is, I don't understand what he's doing in the Middle East. I understand what he's doing with regard to Ukraine. I don't understand what he's doing with regard to the genocide. I don't understand what he's doing with regard to the Houthis. And I don't understand what he's doing with regard to Iran, because these are all losing policies. He would have been much smarter to force Netanyahu to stick to the ceasefire, which would have meant no fight with the Houthis. And he would have been much smarter to work out a deal with the Iranians.
Of course he would have been much smarter, but Mearsheimer, you're smarter than this. It's because the Israel lobby and the Likud party doesn't want the ceasefire, because the ceasefire is kind of tacit admission of the legitimacy of a different power. That's why so many people in his cabinet didn't even want him to go along with the ceasefire, because they thought it would be sanctioning the legitimacy of Hamas or something absurd like that, right? So that's the reason. Mearsheimer knows better on this one, but I get what he's saying. Like, it's counterintuitive and it doesn't make sense, but there are reasons for why Trump is pursuing these policies. It's the Israel lobby.
But getting involved in a shooting match with the Iranians and with the Houthis at the same time you're supporting a genocide does not make sense to me.
Well, I suppose one might say that in order for it to make sense, one might go and read your 2007 book called The Israel Lobby, because I do think, at least for me, my big concern throughout the 2024 campaign and then the election was, and I had a very similar idea toward that as you did, which is I thought the ceiling for Trump could be higher, but the kind of floor could be lower, whereas I just thought Kamala was going to be a disastrous continuation of how things were. And my concern was that, one of his biggest donors was Miriam Adelson, and he said openly in the campaign, Sheldon and Miriam Adelson, Sheldon when he was alive, but they were the people who came most to the White House, other than people who worked there. They were there the most. And every time they were there, they would ask for things for Israel, and I would always give it to them. And he kind of joked and said, but they would come back 2 weeks later and ask for more. And I would say, come on, guys, give me like a few weeks of breathing room. And he boasted that he gave them the Golan Heights, which was more than they even asked for. So, and he said during the campaign.
If any of that is true, by the way, and I don't doubt Glenn, he follows this stuff better than anyone, no one noticed anything that Trump didn't say yes to when it came to Israel. So,
we're going to make Israel great again, and we're going to make America great again. And then he also, as diverse as the cabinet is in many respects, the one litmus test that everybody had to pass in order to be appointed to any kind of significant position was kind of indisputable, unbreakable support for Israel. And I'm just wondering whether you think this is coming from him himself or the kind of influences around him.
Glenn's totally right about that, by the way. Even the people that have generally been perceived as anti-war, even though they're not always, like Tulsi Gabbard and RFK Jr., are staunch pro-Israel Zionists that want military aid to continue to flow through to Israel. So Glenn's totally right about that.
Well, I think obviously the influences around him matter. You and I both know how powerful the lobby is, so there's no question that he's getting pressure there. I don't think Trump cares very much about the future of Israel. I think Trump is an America First president. I personally think what's going on here, I can't prove this, but my sense is that Trump is pursuing a radical agenda. as I described. And there are a lot of very controversial issues at play on that agenda. And it does not make sense, given that agenda, for him to pick a fight with the lobby over Israel. It's just much easier to let the Israelis do what they want, make the lobby happy, don't get any flack from people in the lobby, and if anything, create a situation where the lobby supports you and it doesn't get in the way of pursuing your radical agenda. So I think that by and large, that explains what Trump is doing.
Yeah, and it was interesting, the dynamic in the Republican primary. There were a lot of the hardcore people in the Israeli lobby, the sort of neocons who never trusted Trump, who didn't think he was reliable, and they were almost entirely aligned behind Ron DeSantis. I mean, you can go back and just look at who those people are, and you'll see that they really thought Ron DeSantis does care about Israel a lot more than Trump does. And then it was only once it became apparent that DeSantis had no chance of winning did they kind of start, squirming their way into Trump world in order to make sure that he was on their side with those things. And I guess that is the calculation.
Yeah, that is true. As soon as it became clear that Trump was going to win this nomination, almost all of the supporters of Trump opponents in the primaries went to Trump, endorsed him, and, most of them had the same views on Israel. I mean, Trump's views on Israel aren't even different than Nikki Haley's, for all the, anti-neocon rhetoric and vitriol that Trump and a lot of his supporters spat out during that whole process. So, Mearsheimer is generally right here. I see what he's getting at, but in a way, I don't really feel like Trump's agenda is that radical. It's pretty status quo in many different regards, maintaining or escalating these, long-term forever wars, not only, in Yemen, but also in Israel. That's been an off and on conflict with Gaza for decades. With Ukraine, he withdrew aid for a while, but he restored it for this futile ceasefire potential deal that Russia was never going to agree with. And in fact, all the prerequisites that Putin listed to agree to it essentially echoed exactly the prerequisites that they want to end the war in general. It means like no Ukraine and NATO, no U.S. support, things like that. In terms of like the domestic agenda, yeah, tariffs, I guess we're seeing more radical protectionism than we have in many years. That's probably as radical as it's gotten. But in terms of government spending, in terms of other policies like that, it really is mostly status quo. Immigration is even status quo. There isn't these mass deportations that a lot of Republicans pretended would happen, and a lot of Democrats had trepidations about happening. I mean, there's supposedly 35 million illegal immigrants in the U.S. There's no way that they're going to devote the resources to deport those people. Instead, they seem to have sabotaged any kind of desire to do that by deporting, a few hundred people to the worst prisons in El Salvador for the crime of criticizing Israel. Because this administration is Israel first. As Glenn said, Trump even boasted about wanting to make Israel great again. That's where it's gotten. You can boycott American states, but if you boycott Israel, watch your back. So that's where we're at. But let me know down below in the comments, do you agree with Mearsheimer? Is Trump pursuing a radical agenda like he says? Or is it more or less the Washington status quo? I'd love to hear from you on that. Until next time, though, no more war, no more debt, no more inflation, and no more empire. Take it easy, guys. Peace out.